Welcome to the USIA podcast. I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Duncan Pritchard, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Knowledge, Technology, and Society at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Pritchard has made wide-ranging contributions to the field of epistemology in topics such as radical skepticism, theory of knowledge, virtue epistemology, epistemic luck and risk, among others. And his work has explored ideas in domains such as law, education, religion, and cognitive science. He is a winner of the Philip Leverhulme Prize for Research in Philosophy, a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and an editor-in-chief of Oxford University Press's Oxford Bibliography's Philosophy, as well as the International Journal for the Study of Skepticism. Dr. Pritchard, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You work on skepticism and recently published the Oxford University Press book, Skepticism, A Very Short Introduction. It seems as though we are going through a fairly unique time in our structures around sense-making and how we go about discerning what is true. Given this, how skeptical should we be? And what are the dangers of skepticism?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. Actually, the goal of that book, it's in this series called the Very Short Introduction series, which is designed to take academic ideas and spread them out widely into the general public, was to try and explore precisely that issue, actually. So, I mean, I've been very interested in skepticism as a philosopher. So skepticism as a technical problem in philosophy, but also the history of it in terms of the history of ideas, how it drives science and so forth, how it drives philosophy as well. But the book was about it really exploring its contemporary relevance. So as you say, how skeptical ought we to be? How does this bear on how we should deal with the contemporary life, these phenomena that we face post-facts. Apparently we're in a post-fact world and so forth. And I think this is all connected. I think that, basically, as I try and say in the book, there's sort of two kinds of skepticism. The one kind, which is, I call it a virtuous skepticism. It's grounded in what we know. It can be grounded in science. It's a way of ensuring that we're open-minded, that we're not too dogmatic, that we're questioning of ideas. It's a way of driving ideas forward. I think it's key to the scientific enterprise of treating a lot of our conclusions as provisional, as open to revision and so forth. So that's a sort of virtuous skepticism. But there's also a more radical form of skepticism, which you find in public debate, which I think has dubious intellectual underpinnings. I think it tends to go hand in hand, and this is one thing I argue in the book, with a kind of relativism as well. The virtuous skepticism is driven by a love for the truth. And I think this is what's interesting about skepticism as an idea that drives inquiry, that drives progress, is rooted in a love for the truth and for accuracy and for rationality and so on. So it's not an enemy of those things. But I think the radical kind of skepticism, one that goes hand in hand with relativism, has nothing to do with the concern for the truth. In fact, it's very dismissive of the truth. It doesn't try and ground itself in anything. It has no starting point. It tries to throw out everything all at once, and therefore leaves us with no place to stand, as it were. And I think that's the dangerous idea. And as I try and show in the book, actually, there isn't really any reason for it. I mean, I think there are good reasons for the virtuous skepticism. And I think what tends to happen is those good reasons for the virtuous skepticism, they get converted into these bad reasons for the more radical view. It's always been the problem with relativism, for example. Relativism about truth simply makes no sense, but it can be hard to explain to people why that is, because it can, on the face of it, look like that it's an antidote to certain kinds of dogmatism, but that's precisely what it's not. It's not an antidote to anything.
Absolutely. And you've also done work on the implications of extended cognition, which is sometimes called neuromedia. What technological developments might we anticipate in this area, and what are the epistemological ramifications?
Yeah, so this again, the two issues connect because they're both very much related to the contemporary world and the changes that we're seeing. With the skepticism, for example, one of the issues is how technology drives dissent and disagreement and deceit and so forth, misinformation. Technology is also appearing in this other form in terms of the neuromedia. So our reliance on technology is changing. In fact, it already has dramatically changed in the sense that where hitherto our relationship to instruments was one that we were aware of. You use an instrument, you use it as an instrument. It's distinct from you. But I think increasingly technology, cognitively speaking, is becoming part of you. In fact, that's by design. Tech has become wearable. It's become seamlessly integrated into our cognitive processes. And that's what neuromedia is. Neuromedia is when your technology becomes so seamlessly integrated into your cognitive processes that it's not even clear to you what the source of your information is. Is it you? Is it the media? Is it someone else via the media, and so on? And this is, I think, interesting. I mean, on the one hand, it's the scope for the extension of human knowledge is quite remarkable. I mean, I grew up, I mean, I'm not that old. I grew up when, if you wanted to find out something, you had to go look it up in a book. But my children never experience that. They want to find something out. They just look at their phones. It's incredible and of course, the next generation, maybe don't even have to look for it. They just have to think the thought and the answer's right there. That's, on the face of it, an incredible expansion of what we might know. But it also brings with it lots of challenges, of course. How reliable is this information? If you can't, I mean, at least when you're relying on an instrument, then you can take a certain responsibility for the reliability of the instrument, right? You can check the instrument's giving you good results and so on. If you're not sure whether what you're remembering is your biological memory or whether it's something which is masquerading as your biological memory, then how do you evaluate it for its authenticity, for its reliability, and so on? So I think there's all kinds of social challenges that are going to occur here. That, in a sense, they're familiar challenges. There's always been misinformation. There's always been disagreement. There's always been deceit. But they're just going to take on a new form. I think quite a dramatic form. We will be very soon a sort of, in fact, if not already, cyborgs, essentially. I mean, our cognitive processes extend well beyond our biological cognitive processes, and this is a process that's going to speed up. And I think it raises lots of challenges. I think it prompts us to think about, well, what is knowledge? To what extent, when should it be creditable to you as a biological subject? How do we bring in safeguards to ensure that people can't be radically deceived using this technology and so forth? I think some of the solutions to this are going to be at the individual level. I think we need to inculcate the intellectual virtues into people. I think this becomes ever more important. These admirable character traits, which are driven by a love for the truth and for accuracy, rooted in the work of Aristotle, but they appear in lots of different traditions and different forms. I think they're going to be increasingly important in the modern world. But I think there also will have to be structural solutions to this as well. The individual, there's limits to what they can do to combat some of the challenges this raises. Yeah, so I think this is a fascinating area, and it's going to get more fascinating.
And I wanted to get your thoughts on that because, as we head toward these cyborg-like versions of ourselves, it seems like education would also be very disrupted by these technological integrations. As if knowledge is readily accessible, it seems like many of our existing educational practices would become obsolete. So what do you think the purpose of education becomes once neuromedia is on the scene?
So this is something I feel very strongly about. I've argued at length elsewhere that I think the intellectual virtues are the goal. They're at least from an epistemic point of view, they're the goal of education. Obviously, education has goals besides epistemic goals, social and political and so on, but its epistemic goal is inculcating these character traits. And I think this is really important because if you think of education as just about ensuring people have knowledge or skills or what have you, then we're rapidly reaching a point where there will be no point to education on that model. Why have people know things, teach them to know things when you can just simply give them a device which has the knowledge implanted in it and make it available to them? So it raises interesting questions about what we're trying to do when we educate. I think most educators understand this, if only implicitly, but you find it a lot in the media. Whichever country you're in, there'll be some debate about, why don't the kids know X, Y, and Z? Where there's this, what I call the bucket model of education. Students are buckets, and we have to sort of fill them with things, facts, skills, and so on. But actually, I think there's a lot more to education than that. And if you see it that way, in an age of neuromedia, there is still something for education to do. It's to inculcate these character traits, and that's to have students to develop themselves as characters such that they can think to themselves about how they're using this technology and be suitably critical of the results of it. I think this is why it's very important that we have to engineer some way in which individuals are always able to have some intellectual distance between them and the instruments they employ. Because that's the real danger of neuromedia, that there is no intellectual distance, right? That it just feels like your biological processes. And in fact, that's why I say but this is by design. It works most effectively when it's like that. So I think this is very important. And it's one thing I know others have worked on this. I'm interested both from a theoretical point of view, but also practically. So there's a school near here that another philosopher, Jason Bear, was involved in founding in Long Beach, where the whole curriculum of the school is built around the intellectual virtues and cultivating them. And I'm trying to do something very similar in the curriculum at USIA Irvine. So we have a project which is devoted to integrating the intellectual virtues right across the curriculum. So the thought is that whatever you're learning, it's biology or engineering or economics or philosophy or what have you, you're also learning about the intellectual virtues and how education is cultivating you as intellectually as a person. And I think this is really important. We need to bring that out more and more. There are these sort of social forces that want us to instrumentalize education, to see it compartmentalize. You're just there to learn a bunch of facts in a particular subject area, but that's not what education is about. If that is what education is about, it's a lot. It won't be needed for much longer. Rather, we need to bang the drum for a more enhanced view of what education is about. And I think that's what we need to do as philosophers, both theoretically, make the theoretical case, but also practically as well. Try and find ways of showing how the intellectual virtues should be part of the curriculum at every level.
I very much agree. And I think, as you mentioned, this is something educational institutions are having to grapple with as we speak. I wanted to shift gears a little bit. You've also done work on luck and risk, how they relate, how they're important to various domains. So typically, I might conceive of risk in probabilistic terms, right? What are the chances of an event happening? And then how might I use this assessment to maximize utility or outcomes? What might we be missing by doing this?
So yeah, I think this is really important. I think there's, it's not that the probabilistic way of thinking about risk, which is by far the dominant paradigm, in fact, it's almost universal. It's not that it's wrong, it's just that it misses out something very important. And I think we can bring this out and bring this point into sharp relief by thinking about certain activities which are high risk, but where the risk is low probability. So think about free climbers. I'm talking about like really experienced free climbers, not like if you or I decided one day to go free climbing, but if someone who knows what they're doing goes free climbing. Fascinating activity, I think. It's clearly high risk. Death is right there. There was this wonderful program recently about the guy that is El Capitan, that sheer face, and he climbs up. And it's just, it's terrifying to watch, even though you know how skilled he is. And he does this kind of thing every day and he doesn't die. Probabilistically speaking, these people know what they're doing. They're not likely to die. But nonetheless, death is right there with them on the mountain. This is exactly what people say, actually, people who are climbers, particularly free climbers, that's part of the thrill of it, that death is right there. Now, in one sense, they're not taking risks. In the probabilistic sense, they're not taking risks, high risks. It's not likely they're going to die. We know this because we know the stats. They don't die. They live. Many of them live long lives, right? However, there's another sense in which the activity is very high risk, and this is a modal sense. And what I mean by that is that your death is the kind of thing when you're on the mountain that could easily occur. And I think this is actually more fundamental as a notion to risk than the probabilistic notion. I think the probabilistic notion is actually parasitic on it. Risk is fundamentally about this idea of a danger being a risk event, as I call it, as being the kind of thing that could easily happen. But what's interesting is there are things that could easily happen which aren't likely to happen. And this is why the probabilistic account doesn't quite capture everything. So that's just like what's happening on the mountain. death is right next to you. It's the kind of thing that could easily, you'd make a step wrong and you're a goner. And that's precisely what gives the activity its meaning. It wouldn't have the meaning it does if that weren't true. But this isn't because it's likely they're going to die. If it was likely they were going to die on that mountain, then we should stop them. We shouldn't let them climb the mountain. If it's really, like, if it was me and I said, I'm going to go free climb today, you should stop me. It would be immoral to let me climb that mountain, because it's risky in both senses, not just something. My death isn't something that easily would occur, it would likely occur. But when the free climbers do it, we don't stop them. Why don't we stop them? Because we recognize, although it is high risk, it's not probabilistically high risk. So we have this sense of a kind of risk that's in play, which is quite fundamental, I think, which isn't probabilistic. And I've tried to show that this, I've given an example there in mountain climb, but I think actually there are lots of applications to this. I mean, one application I think is in law. There are lots of issues about legal evidence and about legal proof and so forth, where you can only really understand what's going on if you think there's a kind of risk that isn't just probabilistic. Because, I'll give you one example. There are ways in which, let's think of it this way. Suppose you were convicted on one piece of evidence. Probabilistically speaking, the evidence strongly confirms your guilt. But that's consistent with it being the kind of evidence that could so easily be wrong. Maybe it doesn't take a lot for that evidence to have been fabricated, or for that evidence to have got into the chain in some problematic way. Now, viewed through a purely probabilistic way, then it seems your conviction is safe. It's something you needn't worry about. There's a low risk of you being wrongfully convicted. But of course, if you think about it modally, there's actually a high risk of you being wrongfully convicted. And in fact, I think this is what we want. When we think of a justice system being fair, we think of it being the kind of thing where an innocent person couldn't easily be convicted. So even if the probabilities suggest it, we want more than just the probabilities. We want to eliminate the easiness of this going wrong. It can't be the kind of thing. An innocent person being found guilty ought not to be the kind of thing that could easily happen. And I think actually this is, a lot of legal systems build this in. They don't convict on the basis of one source of evidence, for example. Even no matter what probabilistic basis that evidence might have, they want corroboration. This is a common feature of legal systems. In Scotland, it's enshrined, for example. And I think what's going on there is this thought that fairness, the elimination of legal risk, means not just having high probabilities of guilt, but also showing that you couldn't easily be wrongly found guilty. So I think there's lots of practical implications of thinking about risk this way. And I think it extends even beyond that. You take, particularly when you're talking about very high risk events like, nuclear explosions or something like that, focusing exclusively on the probabilities could be dangerous. It could be that, all your safety depends upon one factor. That one factor lowers the probability dramatically, but it also is the kind of thing that if it went wrong, there's no fail-safe, such that you could nonetheless it could easily be the case that things go wrong, even though the probabilities are in your favor. So it's a bit of a technical notion, but I think this is actually very important, and it's very important to understanding. Going back to the climbing case, the value of certain activities. I talk about climbing there. I think even in the aesthetic case, we get this as well. Think about aesthetic risks. A great one example. I'm not a jazz enthusiast, but I'm told that jazz musicians, they take these great risks. They push their performance to a limit. Is this because what does it mean to take great risks here? Does it mean that they're playing in such a way that it's likely that things are going to go dramatically wrong? Well, I don't think that's what we mean, because to say that is to say they're not highly skilled. Rather, what we mean, I take it, is they take their performance to the very edge, but no further. So they take it to the very edge such that failure is really close, but they don't go across the line. And I think, lots of our activities, the value of it relates precisely to that. It's this taking things to the very edge so that failure, or whatever the risk is really close. The risk is the kind of thing that could easily happen now. We watch the musician do this, or watch the sportsman do this, or what have you. We feel the excitement of it. They're taking things to the very edge of their abilities. That's what it means to take a risk. But they're doing it in a skillful way. So it's not this likely they're going to go across that line. But it is that nonetheless, this is a risk, right? The line is right there. and things could easily go wrong, just like the climber on the mountain, the free climber. So I think, the value of certain activities precisely depends upon us understanding this notion of risk that goes beyond the probabilistic notion.
It's a very interesting perspective, and it also makes me think about like the relationship between risk and meaning, and where that line is upon, like, how are you finding the maximum meaning by sort of pushing that line to the limit.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of puzzles about how risk can play a role in our lives, which we can account for on this view. Because if you think risk is just a probabilistic notion, then you'd have to say that the free climber then isn't taking any risks, right? Or if you'd have to say he is taking risks, but we should stop him. Shouldn't be allowed to climb that mountain because you wouldn't let me climb that mountain, right? That would be crazy. Why is it we let the free climber climb? It's because we recognize there's a kind of risk there, but it's not the probabilistic kind. If it was the probabilistic kind, we shouldn't let him up the mountain. It's a different kind of risk, but it's a kind of risk that gives that activity its value. And I think this isn't just free climbing. I think lots of what we do, risk is what makes it what it is and what gives it its value and its purpose. But it's specifically the modal element of the risk, not the probabilistic element. So we can account for this meaning and purpose and value that attaches to certain kinds of activities that are important to us only this way. If we think of it probabilistically, we just have no theoretical means to understand what's going on.
My final question is, what role do you think organizations such as the USIA can play in promoting productive conversations around the issues we've discussed and related but equally important issues?
Well, there's two things that spring to mind. One is a very general one, that forces of irrationality, they've never gone away. We have this tendency to think that they did. There was a dark ages or what have you, and they went. They didn't. And in fact, in many ways, they're resurgent. They're always resurgent, but they resurge in each generation in a different form. And I think we're seeing them in a very technological form at the moment. And I think anything that we can do to combat that is laudable. The other thing is that you find this in academia and other fields, that there's an increasing specialization, people not talking to one another from different disciplines and so on. And I think that's something we need to do. We need to have a greater understanding of different disciplines and what they can contribute, so that we don't just think of ourselves as specialists in our own individual silo. There's a common, as it were, intellectual cause, it seems to me. And people, it's not just scientists, there's all people from lots of different backgrounds, including, I think, the arts can be involved in this. So that kind of interdisciplinarity, going hand in hand with this battle against the forces of irrationality, I think this is what we need in the modern age.
Dr. Pritchard, thank you very much for your insights and appreciate your time. For those who are interested in learning more about your work, where are the best avenues for them to go?
Well, there's a MOOC. I don't know if we can get links up on the screen, but there's a MOOC on skepticism that goes hand in hand with that book I mentioned. That might be a good place to start. And I've written lots of books and edited lots of books. I guess the book on Skepticism, a very short introduction with Oxford University Press, that would be a good place to start. Maybe that hand in hand with this MOOC, which is a massive open online course. So it's a completely free course that goes alongside that book. So I guess that would be a good place to begin.
We'll definitely link that in the description below. Thank you very much.
Thank you.